recent years, the Kurdish women's movement has gained worldwide attention, fighting colonial oppression and fascism. It has become the most organized and dynamic women's movement in the Middle East. It became a source of inspiration and hope for women and people fighting for freedom all across the world. But how did such an inspirational movement grow within one of the most oppressed societies? To really understand the Kurdish women's movement, we need to have a closer look at the movement's history and the conditions in which it developed. The Kurdish people's origin traces all the way back to Mesopotamia, the cradle of society. In this region, there were goddesses long before gods. Inanna, also known as Ishtar or Astarte, was one of these goddesses who symbolized the important role of women in the ancient societies of Mesopotamia. Sculptures of mother goddesses, myths, ancient architecture, and temples show us the forefront role that women played in society in this period of time, by building up life and society, creating knowledge, and sharing material and immaterial values. Women laid the foundation for a settled village lifestyle based on farming, connection to nature, and communal life. This period, around 12,000 BC, known as the Neolithic Revolution, was in fact a women's revolution. Though 5,000 years ago, male elites, priests and kings, confiscated women's creation and knowledge, accumulating them and using them to gain power instead of for the benefit of society. This started the foundation of the patriarchal society, in which male domination created hierarchies, class systems, and the state. Women were deprived of their rights. They became a property of men and the subject of family structures, seen as objects or birth-giving machines. Abdullah Öcalan describes this process as a counter-revolution against women and the values of the Neolithic Revolution. He sums up the severe destruction and alienation, describing women as the first and last colony. In ancient times, Kurds were mostly animists and Zoroastrian, with a strong connection to nature and the mother goddess culture. Though from the 8th century onwards, with the emergence of monotheistic religions, Islam was enforced on the majority of Kurdish society, and patriarchal codes were imposed on women through religion too. Today, the Kurds are over 40 million people, making them one of the largest populations without a nation-state. Kurdish people are mainly Muslim, though there are many other faiths, such as Alevi, Yazidi, Assyrian, and more. Kurdish is an Indo-European language that has several dialects, such as Kurmanji, Sorani, Zazaki, Kelhuri, and Gorani. Until World War I, the Kurds mostly lived under the Ottoman and Persian Empire, during which they were able to preserve their language and culture due to tribal revolts and resistances, often led by women. Thanks to these resistances, they were able to maintain a certain degree of autonomy. After World War I, in 1923, international powers created the Treaty of Lausanne, drawing up a new map of the Middle East and splitting Kurdistan into 4 parts, with the creation of 4 new nation-states: Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. The Kurds as a nation were left with no legal status or rights. Kurdish language and names were banned. Their own existence was denied, while the nation-states started a homogenization process. Any resistance or revolts were met with oppression, massacres, and genocides. Kurdish women had to suffer these state oppressions as a people, as well as that of women under patriarchy. Economical neglect, national and political oppression in all 4 parts of Kurdistan led to large-scale displacement and migration. This is why today there is a 4 million Kurdish diaspora, 2.5 million of them living in European countries. In the 1960s, socialist youth and national liberation movements spread around the world, including Turkey, where there was a strong youth revolutionary movement. In this context, Abdullah Öcalan started the Kurdish liberation movement with the call, "Kurdistan is a colony." In 1978, together with Kurdish and Turkish students, Öcalan founded the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a revolutionary movement for the Kurdish people's right to self-determination. Inspired by Marxist-Leninist and Maoist theories, the aim of the PKK was to reach an independent, united, and socialist Kurdistan. Since the very beginning, women revolutionaries joined the party. Sakina Jansiz was amongst the founders of the PKK. For women, this struggle meant not only to oppose the colonial state, but also the patriarchal restrictions of family and society. Sakina Jansiz described the early days, saying,
"This movement has addressed the essence of humanity. All our debates, our educations and discourses start with humanity and human values. We were talking about the human situation in the past, in different historical states, and discussing the values of humanity. Women who wanted to understand, they were finding themselves within this movement. In the very beginning of the struggle for Kurdistan and political struggle, the involvement of women was very difficult. Yet we have succeeded, and this gave us the strength to shape our movement."
In 1980, during a NATO-orchestrated fascist military coup, leftist movements were nearly wiped out. Tens of thousands were killed or imprisoned. In the jail of Diyarbakir, PKK prisoners opened a new front of resistance with the call, "Berkhodan Jiane," resistance is life. Also in prison, Sakina Jansiz was one of the leading figures of this resistance, showing how revolutionary women could struggle under any conditions, challenging the women's perception in Kurdish society. In 1984, the armed resistance started by the guerrilla forces of the PKK, against not only the Turkish state, but against hundreds of years of slavery and oppression. In that same period, Kurdish society, especially in rural areas, organized themselves under the banner of the National Liberation Front of Kurdistan, ERNK. In 1987, Kurdish women established the Union of Patriotic Women of Kurdistan, YJWK, which drew huge inspiration from the analyses of the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan. His theory that the liberation of Kurdistan and Kurdish society cannot be reached without the liberation of women gave women more and more confidence to participate actively in organizing and resistance. During the 1980s uprisings, hundreds of thousands of women joined the resistance in North Kurdistan. Driven by their will for freedom and with rocks in their hand, they became the main force behind these revolts and resisted the Turkish army's massacres and destruction of their villages. By the 1990s, the PKK had become a mass movement. Thousands of women joined the guerrilla forces and took up arms, challenging patriarchal gender roles in the movement and in society. Women militants had to struggle with the feudal and patriarchal attitudes of their male comrades, perceiving women as weaker and more vulnerable. Many women fighters and commanders like Beritan embraced this struggle, emphasizing women's will and insisting their rightful place on each front of the resistance. She said,
"Fight, my dear. Fight strong. By fighting, we exist. By fighting, we become free and beautiful and more. By fighting, we love."
The perspectives of Abdullah Öcalan was the greatest support to the establishment of the women's liberation movement in the mountains of Kurdistan. In his analyses on how to overcome the impact of patriarchy and colonialism on Kurdish society, he developed methods of personality analysis, deeply questioning the mentality of the oppressed woman and the dominant man, the family structures and gender roles underlying it. The most essential step for women was to develop love and respect towards their own gender and identity, overcoming alienation and gaining self-confidence as well as trust in other women. A radical new ideology emerged for the liberation of gender in society. The theory of separation laid out the path for women to overcome their enslaved identities by separating themselves mentally, emotionally, and culturally from the male-dominated system. His theory of killing the man encouraged men in turn to subvert and struggle against the dominant masculinity that is not just a gender, but a huge system of power and exploitation. In 1993, Öcalan proposed the creation of a women's army within the guerrilla forces. It became a great challenge for women who had to organize themselves as an independent body, deciding about all aspects of life and guerrilla warfare. Women had to confront their own internalized patriarchal patterns, while also analyzing male domination. By gaining ideological, military, political, and social knowledge and experiences, revolutionary changes took place in the mindset, in comrade relationships between men and women, and as well as in Kurdish society. This was nothing less than a revolution within the revolution. In 1995, 300 women held the first National Women's Congress in the mountains and established the Kurdistan Women's Freedom Union, YAJK, implementing autonomous women's organizing based on women's own will and political and social perspective. This was a crucial developmental stage. On March 8, 1998, the women's liberation ideology brought the women's freedom struggle to the next level. Its framework includes the principles of loving and defending the homeland against colonialism, to think freely and build up free will as women, to organize and struggle for liberation, as well as to build up a life with a free understanding of aesthetics. Exactly a year later, in March of 1999, Kurdistan Women Workers' Party, PJKK, was also established. In 2004, it was restructured into the Women's Freedom Party of Kurdistan, PAJK, which continues to play a forefront role in all four parts of Kurdistan. On February 15, 1999, Abdullah Öcalan was kidnapped and imprisoned in a NATO operation. The operation attacked the very existence of the Kurdish people. In solitary confinement on the island of İmralı in Turkey, in spite of harsh conditions, Öcalan elaborated a new paradigm for the freedom struggle, which goes beyond the solution of the Kurdish problem and proposes a society based on democracy, ecology, and women's liberation. He identified hierarchical power structures based on state and patriarchy as the core of all humanity's problems. As an alternative to the state structures, democratic confederalism promotes a multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multilinguistic democratic nation, which is organized in autonomous structures around the principles of democracy, ecology, and women's freedom. Öcalan's proposal is for a radical democracy with equal representation of all identities, including minorities, and direct participation of all. Also an emphasis on the essential need for self-defense. Society has the right to self-defense against war and violence, exactly like a rose defends its existence with thorns. Without justified self-defense, a society is condemned to exploitation and oppression. The Communities of Women of Kurdistan, KJK, established in 2005, organizes women from all over the world as a confederation and established groups and movements in different places. The common goal is to promote a social transformation that recognizes the needs of all social and ethnic groups. As an alternative way to organize life and society, grassroots women's communes, councils, academies, and cooperatives have been established, and the KJK organizes in every field of society and life. In 2011, genealogy was established, an alternative science of women, life, and society. The Genealogy Academy identifies challenges of the women's revolution and strengthens understanding of the democratic ecological paradigm of women's liberation. Even while constantly fighting against fascist dictatorships and femicides, Kurdish women have continued to organize autonomously, as well as part of the general liberation movement. In 1991 in Turkey, after the founding of the first pro-Kurdish political party, many Kurdish women have been elected as mayors and members of parliament. In 2014, the co-chair system of equal gender representation was implemented in all political and administrative bodies. The women in northern Kurdistan organized themselves autonomously under the umbrella of a huge movement. The Turkish ruling party, AKP, has targeted women, their democratic achievements, and institutions. Thousands of Kurdish women activists, including mayors and MPs, were imprisoned and hundreds of women's associations and organizations were banned. In Iran, the Free Women's Community of East Kurdistan, KJAR, has been clandestinely organizing and educating women, despite the cruel state repression and executions. Southern Kurdistan, Iraq, gained autonomy after the military intervention in 2003 against Saddam Hussein. Since 2002, the Organization of Freedom-Seeking Women of Kurdistan, RJAK, has been working to establish local and grassroots women's associations, organizing education programs and campaigns to empower women and their status in society and politics. Though they weren't able to gain active positions and policies in politics against the regime. The Kurdish women's diaspora in Europe also organized in the 1980s and 90s. They have made Kurdistan liberation and the Kurdish women's movement known worldwide and connected with other freedom movements, creating important networks of solidarity and alliances. Though Europe is not safe for Kurdish women either. On January 9, 2013, Sakina Janzis, along with her comrades Fidan Doğan and Leyla Şaylemez, were assassinated in Paris by the Turkish intelligence service. Kurdish women in Europe continued to organize, in 2014 creating the umbrella of the Kurdish women's movement in Europe, TJKE. The Rojava Revolution brought the Kurdish women's movement on the forefront of the international stage. In 2011, the Syrian uprising against Bashar al-Assad regime gave the Kurds the opportunity to organize Rojava, Western Kurdistan, with the democratic autonomy system. The Rojava Revolution became known all over the world. The YPJ, the Women's Protection Units, was praised for its effectiveness and willingness to fight not just ISIS, but patriarchy within society. Women fighters and commanders played a leading role in the fight against the Islamic State and the resistance against the Turkish occupation, like Arin Mirkan and Avesta Khabur, who sacrificed their lives, became symbols of women revolutionaries. Internationalist women revolutionaries, like Ivana Hoffman from Germany, Alina Sanchez from Argentina, and Anna Campbell from Britain, also joined and became martyred while defending the women's revolution. Women's councils, communes, and organizations are the beating heart of Rojava. Women are organized in the women's movement Congress Star. Congress Star empowers, mobilizes, and educates women to self-organization in order to make sure that the Rojava Revolution will stay a women's revolution, by developing autonomous women's systems in all fields of life and society. Women who were restricted to the role of mother and housewife have reclaimed their rights and are participating in community organizing, women's cooperatives, and institutions. North and East Syria's women's laws promote freedom and equality, protecting women from violence and discrimination within the family context. The co-chair system of equal gender representation is in place at all levels and in all political and administrative structures of the self-administration in North and East Syria. Political life is no longer a male-dominated domain. All the achievements of the Rojava Revolution are the result of a long, difficult fight and great sacrifices of many. Many women have been willing to sacrifice because they see the path to change, to love, and to beauty. Every woman fallen in struggle lives on in the mothers, fighters, and young women of Rojava, reclaiming their lives and futures. The Kurdish women's movement is still an embodiment of the slogan from the beginning: resistance is life, and the goal of life is freedom. Without women's freedom, there will be no free life. And so another cry that has echoed around the world from the Kurdish women's movement is JIN, JIYAN, AZADÜ. Women, life, freedom.
جناب آواز کردستان لسر مقام رجاوا جناب آواز کردستان لسر مقام رجاوا بخوشی آدنگ ساکینان دخوین مرشای پجه بخوشی آدنگ ساکینان دخوین مرشای پجه